Hey guys, it's Jason Snavely, certified wildlife biologist and founder and president of Drop-Tine Wildlife Consulting, the Drop-Tine Seed, of course, Drop-Tine podcast. Guys, I've 17 years private wildlife consultant, graduated from Mississippi State University, and
All right, I am going to interrupt. Most of you have heard that intro, I'm sure, plenty of times, and I want to gather as much information today from two of my guests. This is the kind of podcast that we should really charge for. It's just the information that you're about to hear is going to be mind-blowing, I can tell, because these two individuals who I have on the line, not only do I respect both of them hugely, they are two of my mentors and just two really bright individuals. We are going to get back to soil health. And this is strictly a shooting from the hip, sort of a unique opportunity here to record with Dr. Bronson State, and everybody knows who Bronson is. If you don't, then there's something wrong with you, massively wrong with you. And then on the end, down in Texas, Dr. Rick Haney. And one of the things I enjoy with my podcast is seeking out guests who really haven't been, I guess, recycled through other podcasts. And unfortunately, a lot of the really accomplished folks, they have been, and that's great. And both of these gentlemen have been on the podcast and many, many other podcasts. But I think what's unique about today is the fact that I've brought them together here on this podcast. So I'm excited about this. The stats for soil health, this is something else I'm excited about. I think the two of you will enjoy this. Obviously, with the podcast, you can see the statistics on the unique downloads, etc. What is really cool to me is the unique downloads for anything, any topic related to soil health, regenerative ag, anything in that sort of niche or area of focus is through the roof, which is so exciting for me to see. So I think this particular podcast is going to bring all that together. Dr. Strickland, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about why we sort of brought this together. I'll let you, we were just having kind of a brief chat, and I was like, hold on a minute, guys. I'm not recording. We should be recording this. So I'm going to let you get started.
Okay. All right. I'll jump right in. Thank you, Jason, for having me. And Rick, nice to finally talk to you. I have been trying my best to read, listen, watch all of your material over the past year or so. And you have a vast amount of information out there. And so I am truly a student, and I'm trying to learn, and I appreciate you making all of that information available. And Jason, you set us up for failure when you said you ought to charge for this, because after my ignorance is on full display here, people may want a rebate. But the impetus, I would say, for me, I can't speak for Mississippi State or the Deer Lab, or this has just been kind of a curiosity for me, is just following the progression of regenerative agriculture. And, I'm at a land grant institution, so I see a lot of this information with grant proposals, et cetera, through NRCS and other organizations. And so I've just kind of been following along and seeing what is being done. And Jason, you and others have really brought this to the deer food plot arena. And so that is really what piqued my interest and my curiosity. As you might imagine, I guess anybody that follows our work, they know that within the university, I worked for the Mississippi State Extension Service, which means I'm kind of responsible for outreach and getting science-based information out to producers, hunters, landowners, et cetera. But I also field a lot of questions, whether it be hunters, landowners, et cetera. And so this, like you mentioned, Jason, with tracking your downloads and so forth, this is a topic of real discussion now, and alternative techniques and other ways. And so I got into this really seriously about a year ago, and then several months ago, we are doing our best, and fingers crossed everything works out, but it has not come to full fruition just yet. But we're hoping to conduct about a 4-year research project on this topic, and just not looking at it from an agricultural, a producer standpoint, literally based on from a deer management perspective. And what we want to do is set up a project, randomized, replicated in various locations, where we can kind of monitor the what I call the metrics of interest that I think would be to deer managers. And it's going to be, the amount of biomass we can produce, the economics of it, the cost, the forage quality, or as you often say, Jason, the nutrient density in the vegetation, and then also the attraction of deer and other wildlife to that. And that again is just from my current level of understanding, are things that I think we can measure, things that are tangible enough and meaningful to people that we can measure. And we just want to see, after the end of 4 and 5 years, the pros and the cons. And I'm literally being a blank slate here. And this probably isn't a blank slate. I'm kind of rooting for regenerative agricultural techniques to win out, because based on my background, it's based on biology and ecology and a system that's working in concert. And so, what I'm hoping for is that after 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to get some really tangible results, that we can publish and educate people. But I also want to monitor the real world stuff associated with this. And that is, what is it going to cost? And hey, it works really well in this context, but maybe it doesn't work as well in this context. So I guess, Jason, that's essentially it. Is we are learning and exploring and just hoping to quantify as best we can when it works and when it works best.
My brain just blew up, Bronson. And I know Rick is going to have a lot to add to that with his unique skill set and experience. I muted my mic because I was sitting here chuckling the whole time, and I try my best not to interrupt. But I've got a whole notebook full of bullet points already from what you just kind of introduced, and that, everybody I think at this point knows that I went to Mississippi State, so I support Mississippi State, and I would love to see MSU conduct this kind of research that sort of aims to, as you said, quantify this regenerative soil building or conservation ag practices, and look to tie in sort of the nutrient profile, and obviously, I guess there's so many different medicinal aspects and diet mixing and et cetera, to wildlife food plots. And I'm gonna be very kind. I'm gonna try my best to be very professional when it comes to some of the information on other podcasts. I stuck myself, like you, into this area several years ago. You mentioned others were doing it. They just weren't. I really was hoping that they were. In fact, some well-respected people on Facebook were sort of chuckling and having a good time with it, calling Snavely an organic food plotter, when, to be quite honest with you, I think organic is a complete disaster, just as bad as conventional agriculture. But I looked around, and there were some people who were sort of hinting that they were involved in soil health practices and regenerative ag, or regenerative wildlife ag, as I sort of coined it back then. But they were still using Mehlich 3 soil testing, and they were basically still treating the system like, and Rick, this is sort of wraps up Rick's, not his entire career, but his creation of the Haney health test, is they weren't going the full extent of it. And that's when I hung out with Rick in Kansas for a couple of days. And like, as you just mentioned, your background is biology, so is mine. It made complete and total sense. And fortunately, I have clients all over the country to where we can not test this, but I guess test all of this on the ground. And it's funny that we have to even suggest conducting such research, peer-reviewed, randomly replicated university trials, because nature, as Rick has told me a dozen times over the years, nature is the true test. Nature has been doing this for the research for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, yet we come along and think that we can say, well, let's just see if this is something worth doing because of, like the metrics that you hit. So I'm excited about this. I would love to see peer-reviewed research on this. I also don't think it's necessary. Rick is one of the ones that laughed at me because my desk was full of literature from all walks of life, and at one point he said, "Why don't you just throw all that away and look at how nature really works and functions?" And when I did that and changed my mindset and the way that I look at how the system operates, everything has become not easy, but now I understand what's going on. So, Rick, I'll let you go ahead and jump in on Bronson's comments. I just wanted to throw a few out.
Well, I think that's great what Bronson's doing. And you have to have, in this world, you need that peer-reviewed stuff. I mean, people, that's just the kind of the go-to thing. And, of course, that's what you run up against. What you run up against is, well, our peer-reviewed research, and I did this myself, says this, and nature says that. Well, now what do you do? And what intrigued me about all this was, when I first started talking to Jason, was, deer food plots. And I thought, boy, now we're getting somewhere, because deer management to me is similar to bison roaming the plains or cattle, before modern agriculture took place. And so it's almost like you've got an incubator there for looking at what systems could be like. You're not talking about hundreds of thousands of acres. You're talking about 5 to 30 acres. So, boy, you can actually control that. And I think that's what Bronson sees. It's like, wow, we can really do something with this information if it's managed correctly. And the tie-in with how nature evolved all these systems for grazing, deer, food, cattle, sheep, whatever, and how those systems change over time, I think is an absolutely intriguing aspect and something that you can really do, because farmers are, pretty much just about yield. And as I was saying earlier with Jason before Bronson got on, we had that 150-acre research farm there in Temple, USDA, and my neighbor's corn always looked better than mine, but I always made more money. He out-yielded us, but our inputs were less, so we always made more money. But that's not the sexy thing, right? It's yield instead of quality, and or profit. But deer food plots, now you're looking at something like secondary nutrients. Why do these animals come to these plots? What are they looking for? What are they asking you to do for them? That's to me, that's an intriguing question that nature itself can answer if properly managed.
Yeah, Bronson.
And Rick,
go ahead.
Rick, you just flooded my brain there with a bunch of questions too. So these are little things that I think about. I call it, windshield time. When you're sitting there and driving and you're not listening to a podcast, you start thinking about some of these things and what ifs. And so, Rick, you brought up something that I have and when I say I have a problem with it, I don't mean I have a problem with what you say. I'm having a problem reconciling it myself. Is the example you gave, and I've heard this many times, that for producers, for example, your profitability may be better because your input costs are lower. So you had less bushels per acre, but you made as much or more money. But what happens if you're in a deer management scenario and the bushels per acre is what's important? And not necessarily bushels per acre, but let's say pounds of digestible protein. That's one thing that I think about, is that is a conventional system versus a regen system? If I need to produce, and again, I'm just making up some scenarios here, am I going to be better off producing 8,000 pounds per acre versus 4,000 or 5,000 pounds per acre? And there's a lot of ways, to look at that. Someone can say, well, heck, I'll take 4,000 pounds per acre if I don't have all those fertilizer input costs or my time. I think that is a very valid way to look at it. But I could also see a scenario where the limiting factor, the lowest hole in the bucket, and I'm just picking on crude protein because that's easy. There's a lot of other nutrients and minerals we could say that about. But if that is what is limiting, and a conventional system might get you there easiest, soonest, might that be the way to go? Now we have this other scenario. I'll say one more thing and I'll shut up. One more thing that really intrigues me is the nutrient profile of the plants. And again, y'all are the experts, not me on this, but when I'm reading and listening to all this stuff, little bit more complicated to quantify. But what we're hoping to build into this research is simply, I don't care what it is, what primary or secondary compound is in that plant that's drawing the deer in, but we're comparing them side by side, and whatever it is, the deer like plants grown in this soil with this methodology better than that one. So that's what kind of, I think, a good example of what we're trying to quantify and reconcile with potential trade-offs that we may find with this.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying exactly. I mean, but my question to you is this: 4,000 pounds of biomass versus 8,000 pounds of biomass of what? Because if we're just talking about protein, I'm pretty sure that's not all deer live on is protein. And so if we've got 4,000 pounds of biomass versus 8,000 pounds, but you've got 4,000 pounds that's got the complete diet as opposed to corn or soybeans by only. So it comes down to a question of, do you want them to get everything that they need on your deer food plot, or do you want them to get part of what they need on your deer food plot? That's for what I've understood about all this. And when Fred Provenza, Jason had Fred, he just blew my mind. I didn't even know. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I just stuck them under my armpits and smelled them. But he really made me think about what are they looking for, and is it important that they get it all off your food plot? And if it's not, then that's going to probably change your management strategy, right?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's a very good point. And gosh, it's real early in the podcast to go ahead and throw it out there, though it depends. But it is going.
That's not allowed.
To depend.
That's not allowed here. I'm sick of hearing that.
The data suggests.
Let me jump in at this point, because you guys just brought up a whole bunch, and I can bring in the real world scenarios from the last 6 to 10 years that I don't think very many have. So I think one of the questions, and Rick, Gabe Brown, Steve Groff, and a couple others at the time, and again, no one else had really even asked this, but why aren't we looking at how we're growing our forages, our food plots? Everybody was focused on, Bronson, you mentioned biomass. We've got to lose that garbage. I'll be completely honest with you, and if you listen to the Fred Provenza, and I've listened to that podcast with Fred and I, again, I still had it in my mind that biomass was this Liebig law of the minimum stuff is overused too, was the lowest hole in the bourbon barrel, right? It's that biomass is rarely ever the true issue. And Bronson, you're bringing up protein. I've heard you cannot read an article about food plots or listen to a podcast without it being protein. That blows my mind. We are focusing way too much on protein and what our food plot plants are eating. So you've probably heard the saying, you are what you eat eats. people say you are what you eat.
Mhm.
That's not true. You are what you eats, right? We learned about the food web, food chains in fourth, fifth, whatever, third grade science, and we've all forgot about these. So there is research. I'm sitting here right now on really good peer-reviewed research. Some of this research I'm going to be talking about here with the authors over the next couple of weeks that factually shows that, and they look at, conventional farming versus organic farming versus regenerative practices. So in regenerative practices, I'm talking about more conservation agriculture. So no-till, cover crops, and then diverse rotations. So an understanding of how you can drill fertilizer, meaning seeds, and use specific plant species. This is something that our founding fathers understood so well, but we've become so fixated on nitrogen and protein and synthetic inputs and chemistry. And you can't open up a successful farming magazine now, it blows my mind, and without seeing 37 different chemicals and a bug in a jug. And it's kind of like going to the grocery store now. It just completely depresses me because everything is in a colorful bag, in a box, etc. But Bronson, you brought up pounds per acre of digestible protein. So let me throw in this real world example that started happening to me 6 years ago. Obviously, I am not a wiener, as Rick says. I guess we kind of came up with that together, didn't we, Rick? We decided that based on everybody wants to wean off of something, right? If you want to go onto a new diet, maybe you go to McDonald's once a week, or as people say, Friday night's my cheat night. Well, that's not going to work. I'm sorry. Eventually, Saturday morning is going to be your cheat morning, and then Tuesday and Thursday, etc. So one of the things that I noticed early on, as soon as I pulled the synthetics, and that was my first thing, is that the deer came to my fields, even though I really didn't believe, based on my education at that point, I had good food plots. I thought, oh my gosh, what did I just do? They're eating them lip high, and there's just, utilization cage inside, outside. There's a little bit of a difference, but I don't have anything taller than 2 or 3 inch plants. And I have conventional agriculture around me, right? Massive, generational agriculture, corn, soybeans, alfalfa, string beans, hay, you name it, pretty much all the cereals. So they had access to everything, and I cut the soybeans. And you can hear in the Provenza podcast why I cut the soybeans. But I have clients who say the same thing to me, is that they say, Jay, my plots look bare, but yet we continue to kill just as many deer or bucks or whatever as we always have. In fact, we have more deer than we've ever had. So I know you would say, Bronson, that's not peer-reviewed. That's not science. That's just an observation. That's anecdotal. But I would argue that all research is ultimately anecdotal. I've been a research tech, and trying to triangulate where the covey of quail are. It's kind of a guess. So I think what you're going to find, which is going to probably be somewhat difficult to prove scientifically, is that the forages, the food plots grown in nutrient-dense soils, biologically active soils. So with our ST1 meter reading 10,000 plus CO2 in field, those are the fields that deer and other, I don't want to just target deer here, all other species and the entire food chain, so the insects, etc., everything is found in that environment. And I think, I listen to some of these other podcasts on food plots, and they talk about the conventional system. Bronson, I heard you say it's easier. So is going to McDonald's. But I think we're missing the primary, the secondary. This research here, for instance, there was 46% more vitamin K, 31% more vitamin E, and 33% more vitamin B1, 60% more vitamin B3. My gosh, it just goes on and on in regeneratively grown vegetables. In this case, I think it was cabbage. than there were in organic, which is massively destructive to the biology, and conventional. So I think part of, Rick, you and I were talking about this. I think that the biggest hurdle is getting over the yeah buts. Yeah, but that's going to be the hardest part, I think, in the academic world.
Well, sure, and we're so used to. I mean, I understand science as a tool. I don't understand science as a god, and it, some people think it is, and other people think it's not. So it just gets challenging, because one of the most difficult things I ever ran across was when my intuition was telling me this and the science was telling me that. Which was actually a good thing, because it makes you dive deeper into the science. It makes you look at it from a different perspective. It makes you try to comprehend, how does the system actually work? Because the system works. And I love that Bronson is an ecologist and biologist, because, boy, that's where the ball game is system thinking with living things. It's not non-system with dead things or inorganic things. That's not the system. And so it's such a challenge to wrap your head around that the science is out there. The science is happening every day in the field, every day. And we had this guy who was arguing with us a while back, not too long ago, and he was talking about replication. I said, man, replication's great. I said, but when you're looking at biology, we're talking about variability. Mm-hmm. Because no two people are the same. Not everybody functions the same. No two cows are the same. No two deer are the same. Everything changes, and we have to get our head around that somehow. And he was saying, well, I just don't think that's right. And I said, well, I said, are you replicating? And he said, well, no. And I said, well, are you real then? Can we believe you? And then he said something else, and I said, well, the sun comes up every day. Do we have replicated on that every day? I mean, there's things that are. We don't have to go all sciencey on some things that are. And I'll say this, and this will be dumb, but I remember my great grandparents' garden as a child. And that food coming out of that garden was the best food I have any recollection of ever having. And that may just be because I was young, but most people that have a garden know that food tastes better than the stuff they get at the grocery store. Why? I mean, that's a simple question. Why? And that's something that science can answer if we look in the right places.
Yeah, I just had a tomato sandwich for lunch today, and it was the first tomato we actually got out of our garden this year. And it just, my taste buds were doing backflips. And I actually said to my wife, it doesn't matter how many of these tomatoes and peppers I eat from our garden, it still blows my mind how drastically different that flavor profile is coming out of my. Now, obviously, I cover crop it. It's always covered. You very rarely find naked soil in my garden, so I follow the principles. But yeah.
Well, if you had the funding and the people, you could run that down with science. You could find out why that is. You could look at the chemistry. You could look at the biology. You could find that question and get the answer to it. But it would take an enormous amount of funding and an enormous investment in brain power and stuff. But the point is, that doesn't mean we should just quit. And I applaud Bronson for trying to do this in that type of setting, because that's just so challenging. But all I would say was, boy, when your intuition's screaming at you, pay attention to that some if you can, and try to get the science to help you get there. Instead of it being going against it.
Real quick, I want to go back to Bronson here, but I want to read this. The author of this book, I've been reading it. He's going to be on the podcast. We'll actually be recording tomorrow, but I just want to, it was interesting. I just flipped it open because I highlighted it last night as I was falling asleep. And he says, focusing on yields like bushels per acre, pounds of an animal, and gallons of milk is laudable. What's that mean, Bronson? Laudable?
But worthy of praise.
Okay, thank you. It helps fill bellies and pay farmers. But quantities harvested tell us nothing about whether those foods contain enough of the right mix of nutrients to help us grow when young and imbue us with wealth throughout life, especially as we age. So it's kind of interesting how it sort of hit. I just read that last night, and that's kind of what we're talking about today. So, Bronson, go ahead and, as I know you're an educator and you're a great one, go ahead and throw out more of the yeah buts, hypothetically, plain devil's advocate, that you hear, or I know you've been doing a lot of research on soil health, regenerative ag. What else, or maybe you want to continue what Rick was just saying, but go ahead and throw out more of them. Let's just kind of talk about those.
Yeah. So in the spirit of shoot from the hip and spitballing, I'm still not convinced on the biomass part of it. And here's where I'm coming from, is that we always, with the deer management, the seminar, Jason, I told you I was given this morning,
Yep.
talking about this very thing, is we are always having to control for density. Is that we always have this dynamic from year to year, and we can't predict it. And it's even worse where Rick's at in Texas with rainfall variability. But we're always having to predict what is available and how much food we have. And we see booms and busts based on that. If you're in Texas, especially South Texas, and you have 2 to 3 consecutive years of drought, buddy, the quail population is going to drop. I mean, tangibly, noticeably. We even see that with deer populations.
But doesn't that just make sense as nature throws that? I mean, the natural, that's sort of like this climate change debate. I mean, the natural cycle of, I know what you're talking about, South Texas, the hill country of Texas. That's where Rick is sitting now. I've lived and breathed that, but nature is not, what's the saying? Rainbows and butterflies, or whatever that saying is. It's not, it's resilient. It's incredibly resilient, but I don't know. I think I agree with Rick. If you have, is this my podcast? This is only mine, right?
I think it is.
Okay. I was going to say something. I'm trying to censor myself, but if you have a given volume of forages that are grown synthetically in a chemically, I guess, how would you call it? Chemically driven system, as in conventional agriculture. And then you take, this is what's going to be fun someday, is I know when you look at the forages from properties like mine, properties like my clients, even in, parts like you're talking where they're quote unquote struggling, it's not going to take nearly as much in whatever quantity you're measuring to nourish an animal, to nourish the entire ecosystem. And I don't know if you guys ever read The Dorito Effect, but that's kind of interesting and kind of plays into this topic of we are filling ourselves with a whole bunch of empty calories, right? Watch your kids eat or yourselves eat or whatever. The more, if you start eating healthy, Bronson, I know you're a healthy guy and you try to be healthy. We've talked about some of these biohacks in the past. If you eat nutrient-dense foods like my tomato out of the garden, you are full longer than if you go to McDonald's. Every time I go to McDonald's, I'm not going to lie to you, my daughter's in travel softball and we travel a fair amount. I eat it every now and then. It makes me so sick, but I was imprinted on it from day one. I'm always hungrier when I'm done eating a 2 cheeseburger meal, whatever number that is now. And that just blows my mind. And the Dorito Effect talks about these empty calories. So, whether you're looking at native vegetation or supplemental vegetation, I would agree that native vegetation likely has far better flavor, far better nutrient profile, more secondary compounds, and medicinal value, which I think everybody's missing tremendously. Whitetails can't just go get a shot, call it a COVID vaccine, after they changed the definition of a vaccine. All interesting. They don't go to the pharmacy. They have to self-medicate. So I can see why you're struggling with it. I used to love looking out into my fields and seeing 5-foot-tall Eagle forage soybeans. And then it dawned on me after I looked in the the stool of whitetails, and I looked at how mature bucks still traveled to peel the bark off of hemlocks, that, okay, somebody's done a really good job of selling me on yield, tonnage, giant leaves, but that's not how nature works. As Rick said, my intuition said something completely different.
Well, but if you're talking, and I think what Bronson might be saying is that, like in a boom and bust situation, especially like here in Texas, where you get drought, then rain. And so if your biomass explodes, then maybe your deer population falls and it explodes so it can survive the next 2 years of drought. Maybe something like that. But again, and so I'll never forget, this guy told me one time on the soil test, he said, well, your fancy soil test ain't going to work if it don't rain. And I said, well, neither will the fertilizer you put out. And that kind of ended that conversation. But the point we're trying to get to here, I think, is, you would want times to be good and be really good. And if you can really grow a big biomass, there's going to be more deer eat it. They're going to maybe survive better. But then again, nature's weeded out the weak for many, many thousands of years with the survival of the fittest thing. And so big biomass might lead to other issues that we don't foresee or not foresee. I don't have all the answers. It's just that it's a tougher game, especially in what Bronson's trying to do, because he's trying to do replicated, all this dynamic stuff. And what if the weather doesn't cooperate? We ran into that at the research station. Our cover crops, it wouldn't rain. We planted cover crops, it wouldn't rain for 2 months. And, well, what do you do with that data? Well, nothing. And so what he's suggesting doing is very, very challenging.
Yes, but I would also argue then, from a non-scientific standpoint, when it doesn't rain on my farm and around my farm, it's really fun to watch and listen to the farmers as they panic. And I invite them over here to see what a more resilient system looks like, right? So I can stretch much longer periods now that I have soil structure, now that I keep plants obviously in, root system in the ground and plant residue on top of the ground. So yeah, I see what you're saying as far as these ecosystems that are challenging. And listen, I've got one right now that's challenging to me, and a lot of my clients are in the Piedmont region of South Carolina, stretching up into North Carolina, parts of Mississippi. Those regions are a challenge, but I'm enjoying that.
Yeah, and you touched on something, that the resiliency is really something that's going to be challenging to measure, but it is there.
So I guess, Bronson, let me ask you this. I think
the resiliency, let me comment on how we've been thinking about that as well. I think the resiliency part is going to come in to where you look at, and this is going to depend on random luck, but hopefully with enough sites, you'll capture some of this. It might be that with a conventional method in a given year, when conditions are good, enough rainfall, timely rainfall, you produce 25, 40% more biomass in this example. However, on a 5-year run, where you had 2 of those years, you did not have optimal timing or amount of rainfall, I think you look at the cumulative total amount of food plot forage that you produced over that 5-year period. That's one way we've been thinking about mitigating the weather variability. Is let's not look at it on this year. Let's look at on average on 3 years. What are we doing?
Yeah, that's right. Because trends is where nature lives. It lives with trends, not right now versus 20 minutes from now. It's a trend, and we so many times just look at an isolated system, and well, how many guys have turned to cover crops and it didn't rain that year? It's like cover crops don't work.
Right.
I mean, that's what we run into a lot. And it's like, well, yeah, they didn't this year. You're right. And having to build, nature has its own timeline, and it's not ours.
Yep.
We need these things to happen now. And, nature's like, whatever, it'll happen when we, want it to. So that again makes it very challenging. But it doesn't negate the fact that nature has its way. And if we can figure out how to mimic that, our chances go up.
Yeah, and it's funny, Rick. This morning, the first email I got addressed, it was a a Texas seed customer of mine, and he's disappointed because he had a failure. Obviously, they had a rough year and, complete failure. And, he said, I don't know, I guess I might have to plow. And I sat back and thought to myself, is plowing going to make it rain? That just blew my mind. And I thought, I actually sent back to him, super great guy, and he's going to succeed. And I said, wait a minute, this is the first year. This isn't easy. If this were easy, everybody in every shiny magazine and on every podcast would be farming in nature's image, as opposed to making agrochemical more wealthy and destroying the ecosystem along the way. So I guess, Bronson, one of the questions I was going to ask you is, in this research, I could tell you're hooked on biomass. Will you consider the quantity of the the quality of the forage, or just the quantity? Because I think that would be a complete disservice to the whitetails and the funders of the project.
Oh, in short, absolutely. Absolutely. The quality of the food is critically important. Yeah, that is absolutely no problem. But Jason, I'm sorry, I'm kind of stuck on something, but let me propose two scenarios, and I'm opening myself up. So if I'm wrong, please point it out. But here's why I think what I think of why biomass is important. Is I'll give you artificial setting scenario and a natural. So Jason, as well as I, we can even go into your neck of the woods. Let's go into an eastern forest and let's clear cut 1,000 acres, 5,000 acres, whatever. And depending on your ecosystem, temperature, moisture, etc., you're going to have a flush of growth.
Maybe
there is going to be, naturally, given enough time, there will be a flush of growth. And the deer are going to respond. Nutrient quality, dietary quality, and biomass is going to be there. And the deer population is going to respond unless there's some external force. So let's take human harvesting out of it. The deer population is going to respond. Depending on the system you're in, year 10, year 15, whatever, the canopy of that naturally regenerated or artificially regenerated forest is going to start capturing the sun's energy. Sun is no longer hitting the ground. Food for deer, biomass of food, is going to be limited. And the deer population is going to respond.
Sure.
Now, maybe they don't die. Maybe they just get smaller. Maybe on average, instead of a doe having 2 fawns, she has 1 fawn, or a fawn for every 2 does. But the deer population is going to respond to food availability. The artificial example, if you go to the Midwest and go to Google Earth and put down a cookie cutter somewhere for 1,000 acres, and if half that area is in soybean every year, and you take the soybean out of the system, then that deer population needed was relying on that biomass. And the deer population will respond negatively to it. That's all I'm saying with this, is that biomass is an important component. And Jason, you remember when we model, and again, these are just educated guesses. Nobody can go out and say, the deer carrying capacity on this property is this. We all, if you think you can do that, you're demonstrating you don't know a lot.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
It's really complicated to try to collect all the plants that deer eat, but we come up with a carrying capacity estimate for the property,
which changes by the day.
It changes by I would say certainly by the week and by the month, but it absolutely changes. Because it's in flux, it's in dynamic.
Sure.
But all we can do is estimate.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing that biomass.
The two factors that you multiply together for that is biomass times quality. So to wrap all that up, it would be foolish on our end, to not include quality in what we're measuring. We're absolutely going to do that.
Okay, so I will say that I'm not disagreeing that biomass is important. I never said it wasn't important, But if you give me the opportunity to pick and choose quality over quantity, whether I'm filling my gut, my kid's guts, my dog's gut, or the whitetail's gut, I'm taking quality over quantity all day long. And it's funny that the state agencies, universities, right, all we talked about was harvesting enough does to maintain, you're talking about, biological carrying capacity, social carrying capacity. That's all they talk about is we have too many deer. Let's kill more deer. And I understand it fluctuates. I'm game with that. But it's time we forget about biomass for a little bit. It's time we forget about protein for a little bit. My gosh, we're pumping so much protein through these deer. I mean, I see some of these food plot companies, it's 44% protein. I'll give me a break. We don't need 44% protein. So I guess I completely agree with your clear-cut scenario is nature being nature, right? And I've been to properties where it's funny that they don't see this, but I guess they're just not trained in it. They say, hey, this spot used to be good. My dad used to sit me here or whoever, and I would shoot deer all day long. And I would say, what did it look like? Well, none of these trees were here. It wasn't, full canopy closure. It was thicker. All right, let's rebuild that. I understand what you're saying. I just think it is time. And it's funny. I'm asking you to do this for the white-tailed deer when we can't even nourish our own guts. I mean, look at the chronic illness in humans. It's a disgrace. We can't figure this out. And it all reverts back with humans, deer, etc., to the soil. The soil ecosystem is where it's rooted. Pardon the pun. It all starts there. And there are very few universities who are focusing on the quality of forages in food plots, obviously. I listen to some of these other podcasts, and I mean, these guys are still in preventative mode, spraying for armyworms just in case. Rick, does that ever work even in an agricultural setting?
No, I remember a farmer in Oklahoma, and he sprayed for armyworms every year. You know why? Because he was conventional till, monoculture wheat, and every armyworm generation knew exactly where his fields were.
Yeah, so let's address the underlying cause.
He basically was attracting them to himself.
Exactly. And that's what I guess my wife and I had this conversation. She laughed. She said, you're expecting people to do this for deer when we can't even do it for ourselves. Look at what people think wheat bread is them eating healthy. How was that wheat grown? How were the soils grown? Well, it was grown locally. I don't care if it was grown in Mexico. Tell me more about how it was grown. Again, getting back to you are what you eat eats. It's not about growing yield. It's not about these highly bred. Rick, you and I have talked about this. The seeds that we're planting now are garbage. These things have been selectively bred by plant breeders or whatever they call themselves to chase yield or to be resistant to an insect or to be resistant to a chemical. The nutritive value in that seed is gone before it even germinates. Who's looking at that?
Well, one of the things that I've been lucky to do is working for Lance at that soil testing labs. I see all the data that comes through there, and I've been looking at the soil from a little bit different perspective in that we got these tissue analysis, we have this total nutrient digest of a soil, and then we've got, the so-called Haney test and all this stuff. And what shocks me about the information that I've seen is that we've got a bunch of samples that come through that are native pastures or native rangeland or native grasses. And the balance, these are not jacked up systems. These are balanced systems that don't have excesses of much of anything. Everything is recycled. And, we've got to start getting our head around that these excesses are not insurance. They're actually anti-insurance because we want the system in balance so that it can function properly and react the way it needs to. If we have way too much nitrogen in a system, it throws everything off. Microbial community shift, the balance goes away. And it's almost like, Occam's razor, it's like walking on a straight edge. And when you knock that balance off, it takes years to bring it back.
Yeah.
And I don't even know where I'm going with that.
Well, I would interject and argue that nature, and this is also, I think, Bronson, what's going to make it difficult, just playing devil's advocate, difficult for you to do what I want you to do, is that nature has these qualities. This is one thing I've learned in the last 5 to 10 years from people like Rick and Gabe, is that nature has these qualities in symbiotic, complementary fashion that are not, I should say, never present in their parts. And, I was trained, obviously, I heard you say the word control. I don't like that word control at all. I like manage. I understand scientists, academicians like control. They have to have a treatment and a control, and they have to control for this and that. But you can't ever pull one thing out of nature and say that it's behaving like it did when it was a part of the whole, and you can't say that the whole is behaving as it was before you pulled that part out. Does that make any sense, Bronson?
Well, I disagree. I think you make a point, but I think it depends on the system. If I were to have the efficacy of a medication evaluated, I would, ideally want it compared against a control population.
A medication like
that didn't
what?
have it.
You mean
Well, I think he's talking
any
about
type of treatment
that doesn't have a treatment applied. So basically, the natural.
Yeah, I'm talking about nature. I'm not talking about antibiotics.
Yeah, well, even in this context, a control would be we don't do anything to a particular plot. So if we wanted to look at, say, attractiveness of deer, per acre or per plot or whatever, right here to the left, we've got regenerative ag. Right here in the center, we have conventional ag. And right beside it, we have the exact same area size plot where we didn't do anything. And then what we're assessing relative to the natural world is, did deer or turkey or whatever, assuming you got a lot of replication here, did they respond above or below what the control was? In other words, the place where we did not apply a treatment, we didn't do anything, that's our baseline we're comparing it to. I think you need that. I don't think you can just have, even though it's been done, I don't think you can just have treatments. You want to compare your treatment against, hey, I didn't do anything. Because that's how we measure effect size, and that's how we can measure the economics. So, for example, I didn't do anything. All I did right here on this acre is once a year I drop a match on it. I just burn it. On this one, I put $5,000 worth of inputs. On this one, I had $100 worth of inputs. Well, you might get out that the one you had $500 worth of inputs, you had twice as many deer. But I can sit there and make a decision, but heck, I didn't do anything to this plot, and I still had a bunch of deer. I mean, I think you need that control to quantify the response of what you're measuring.
Well, Bronson, when I was developing the Haney test, people were saying, well, yours isn't calibrated. Your test isn't calibrated. Well, I didn't calibrate to fertilizer response, which is what all other tests have ever been done. I was calibrating to the control plot. In other words, I was looking for, what has nature given me that we're not accounting for, which is why we have 40% efficiency in nitrogen uptake for fertilizer use. I wanted to know where the other 60% was coming from and account for that. So,
I heard you give that exact example in one of your presentations. I recognize that.
So I understand what you're saying. I mean, your version of control is not doing anything. I think what Jason was hearing was you're going to control all these different inputs.
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry. I either misspoke or Jason misunderstood, but I'm glad we clarified.
I agree with both of those. I don't like the word control as it's, let's say, predator control, right? We've had that podcast with Dr. Leopold Bronson, Doc.
Oh, yeah.
The word control cracks me up because in my opinion, and I don't place human beings at the top of the intelligence pyramid. That may offend some people, but we're not real intelligent.
It's coyotes.
Yeah,
coyotes.
I would put coyote. Look at it; they're beating us. But I do not like the word control. I'm not questioning your control treatment. I fully understand that. But where I took it then was Do you feel like you can go out in nature in a system that is so complex and so self-regulating, self-organizing, and think that you can impose your human will on it, pull something out of it, and then say that the whole still performs as it did prior to when you pulled that part out? I guess it's maybe a philosophical conversation for a bourbon drinking event, but I guess I read a lot of science now.
I think I can answer that.
Go ahead.
I think how I would answer that would be, let's not even talk about agronomic plantings. Let's not even talk about food plots. Deer evolved without us planting anything for them. And we can let Mother Nature on her time scale manage the deer population. And you might be in an area where you have closed canopy forest because that's the system that you're in. But you're going to have to put up with what Mother Nature is giving you. And so if you're in a 200-year cycle where the forest is closed canopy, that means you don't have many deer. So what we do, Jason, not even talking food plots here, what we do in wildlife management is, again, we mimic nature with ecological disturbance. We go in and we harvest trees and we use prescribed fire. So we manipulate the plant community so that the wildlife are attracted to it and benefit from it and respond from it, so that now we're getting to a human value type of issue. A lot of this is done not for the good of the deer. It's because we want to see deer. We want to harvest deer, and we manipulate the environment for that.
Sure. And I've spent the last 20 years of my life doing that, so I fully understand that. However, a little bit ago, you were not happy with those boom and bust South Texas, even Central Texas, parts of Mississippi, Florida, even Wisconsin and other parts of the country have their own struggles. You were not happy with the biomass produced in some years. So I understand
I was clarifying that biomass is important and is driving the boom and the bust. It doesn't matter to me. If I were in your case, it's like, what does my client want? In Mississippi, what does a constituent want? I'm just advising them of how to moderate the boom and the bust. And in some cases, it might be a more reliable year in, year out source of biomass that can smooth out the boom.
Okay. Yeah, we spent enough time on that. Let's stick to our topic again of soil health and regenerative agriculture. So I can tell, based on what I'm hearing, let me rephrase that. If you did a project, PhD student, really smart, spend a bunch of money, and at the end they all say, we need more research on this, which is sort of a catch-22 cycle of keep funding the beast. And I get that. Sometimes that's part of the scientific process, is to repeat, right? Keep on repeating. I love that. If the paper didn't show anything based on what the technicians went out and recorded and the student wrote up in his dissertation, would you still be conducting research, or would you say, all right, this is garbage, we're done? Because there's an awful lot of research dollars wasted today on things like vaccines for CWD, complete waste. But I don't see anybody spending money on soil health, regenerative farming practices, and how it could impact. I've had farmers say to me, you guys only plant food plots. How much positive ecological impact could you have? And I laugh and think back to when I started sending samples into Rick to his lab. My clients were totally annihilating production agriculture. And I remember thinking, that's excellent. Our soil health calculation or CO2 burst, whatever you wanted to look at, Rick can chime in if he wants, was always better than production ag. And I thought that they were doing great. And then I sat down and I thought, wait a minute, these people are raising our food to send to food companies to shove in boxes for cereal for my kids or wheat for pasta or whatever, you see where I'm going. That's horrific to think that food plotters are doing a better job of farming than farmers are doing. So I guess getting back to the whole, that concerns me that we don't have enough research in this area. And that's why I was excited and challenging you to do it and run with it. There's nobody better, in my opinion, to do this than you. And I'm just
appreciate
curious.
That. Well, I think what Rick mentioned earlier would be everything. And for those that don't write in the scientific community or read the type of stuff we read, Jason reads, I think that is what your discussion in the paper is about, is you have your results and you report your findings. The discussion part is when you reconcile. We found this, someone else found that, this might be the reason, and then you kind of wrap it up with what going forward. And I think wrapping it up going forward would be, tying this back to what Rick said, is the trend. I think if in any of these metrics that we're interested in, if you have a trend, a signal, even if it's a weak signal, but it's a reliable, your teaser for, we got something here. Let's double down again. Let's try to figure out what the mechanism is. And I'll use the biomass word again. It may not be biomass. It may be, like I said earlier, we don't have a darn clue what it is about this plant that is sucking the deer in, but by golly, it is. Then that is a metric of interest, and would certainly warrant, let's keep going with this. It may end up that, hey, once we're above ground, we don't see any change with the deer, but below ground, look at what is going on with these, I'm doing the air quotes here, the soil health metrics. We're seeing some real change here. And posit that in our environment, we might need 3 more years to really, but we're getting a trend in the direction. I think that would warrant to keep going, a trend.
Yeah, I agree. So from a biological aspect, I guess where the rubber meets the road, if you were to look at the CO2 burst, you have an ST1 in your hands now, right? If you were to conduct these tests and you saw more active or biologically active soils, and that equated to greater forage density or whatever you're looking at, and Provenza and many others have done incredible work, so it's there. Rick, what does that mean? Why do we want a more biologically active soil ecosystem? I just feel like there's this huge void in an understanding of why that matters.
Well, there is, and it's fun. It was fun to me back years ago because I'd have these companies send me these products. Right, they're going to stimulate microbial activity, increase your yield, do all these things. And some of it was rock dust, some of it was sugar. And you get this burst of CO2, and it was like, well, see there. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean much of anything. I mean, give kids sugar and watch them, spin off. But what we're looking for is the biologically active in the natural setting. That's where, as you put it, the rubber meets the road. So if you've got native pasture or native range A versus B, and the respiration, let's use an ST1 reading of 8,000 on one and 2,000 on the other, that's there for a reason. Whatever plants are growing are feeding I think the plants farm the microbes. That's what I think, because they're the ones dumping the foods that the microbes. That's why the microbes are there. And it's a symbiotic relationship to some point. But we can see such stark differences in soils with that little tube in the ground and monitoring the CO2 that's in that soil. And that CO2 coming off is there because of a number of reasons. The quantity and quality of the food, the population that's there. Microorganisms are niche organisms. If some other chemical starts showing up in the ground, here comes a different set of microorganisms to utilize that. There's nothing wasted in those systems. And so what a simple thing to be able to monitor CO2 because of biological activity. And I think if nothing else, that little system is going to be such a great educational tool and give Bronson many more windshield moments where he could think, okay, now why did it do that? Or why did you do this? Because the greatest thing I ever did with that was when that first time when I just, a couple of years ago, got it going, was looking at it and it rained and we'd been droughty and I've been monitoring CO2 and it was down to like 600 or 700 part per million, which is barely above ambient. And then it rained and we got 1.5 inches of rain and it went from 600 part per million to like 7,000 part per million in, less than 48 hours. And that also shocked me because when I was in grad school, they said, well, if you take a soil and you take it out of the field and you take it to the lab, you have to wait 7 to 10 days before you can test anything. You have to re-wet it and wait 7 to 10 days. And that was so telling to me because it's like you missed the entire game. It's like you showed up to play basketball and there's no players and the crowd's not there. Because that's what, the science said that you should do, which made sense several decades ago, but we completely missed that flush, which is where the whole ball game is. And so that's just such a sensitive test for different systems that you can put in so many different places, like a conventional system versus a regenerative versus an organic versus a control versus they'll tell you, I'm a big fan of nature is talking to us and we're just not using the right things to listen.
So, Rick, I've got a question for you. And I promise this is not a gotcha. This is a sincere question. Do you see, like I understand some of these scenarios where 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, conventional agriculture and using your tool and what you're describing. How does that compare? And excuse me if I've missed this, but to me, it seems like these comparisons are made with regenerative versus conventional. What happens when you walk in the woods and put it in the ground, or you walked into a prairie and put it in the ground where the only disturbance has been animals and fire for 2 decades?
That's where you learn.
How do those soils compare?
That's fun.
Oh, we've done that. And I'll give you a quick example. I took a year or so ago, I took one to a farmer in Oklahoma, and he had a native pasture. Grass had trees, like 10 feet from his conventional till field. And we sunk tubes in both. We let them set 24 hours and came back the next day. And the conventional field was like, 1,400 part per million. And 15 feet away in his native pasture was like 7,000. And I'll never forget the look on his face because he said, "What are you telling me?" And I said, "I'm not telling you anything." I said, "What are the microbes in your soil telling you?" And he made the leap. I mean, he said, "Well, I'm screwing them up with this tillage." I said, "Yeah." And I could have slapped him and I could have hit him with a 2x4 and done less damage. And he walked away from that like, what is happening? And that's the elegance and the beauty of such a simple system, because both those systems are 10 to 15 feet apart, and they both have the same geology, the same climate, the same, everything. The only difference is management.
Bronson, that was an excellent question, excellent response. I have 2 real quick points. That is what drove me to look at food plots further and say, we're doing this all wrong. So I'll ask you, ask yourselves this question: how good is modern agriculture for our health? And you don't have to answer that right now, but as you drive around the country roads in Mississippi, Texas, and Pennsylvania, and wherever you are, look at how bad farmers have become. They're clueless. They're incorporating management on their farms based on how much Uncle Sam, which is me, you, those of us who pay taxes, is going to give them when they fail. They're planning to fail, but they're picking the management or the crop, etc., that will pay them the best when they fail. So we're paying them to fail. And these are the people who are feeding us, and the same people who were told by their bankers and the government to ask questions at soccer, football, and basketball games of the local people in the community, such as, well, you want us to feed the world? We have to use this Roundup, soccer mom. Now that you're chemical sensitive, this is why we have to use it, because we're trying to feed the world. But that example that Rick brought up, I've done that. Some other ag consultants have sent me text pictures and CO2 readings of, a tube under a barbed wire fence and then out in a disgusting looking cornfield or wheat field or whatever field. I started doing that with food plots. So if we can't raise good food to feed us, do you really think we're raising good deer food in our food plots? The answer is absolutely not. And when I hear people dumping chemicals, running plows, disking, fertilizing, and then they ask, how do you not put lime down on your fields, and how is your pH 7.2, and why is it higher than 7? I look at them and I laugh and I say, go ask the microbes, because they're in charge now and they're doing it.
Well, and that's the other thing. Our management has been selecting for certain species of microorganisms. And, that's where us and our big brains are supposed to come in. It's like we're supposed to be able to recognize this and try to help nature get back to what it was, instead of just deciding, well, we're going to, grow 300 bushel corn and call it success, when you could grow 200 bushel corn and make money. You know what I mean? We've got to change the context about what we're looking at. And that's what's fun about. And again, that's what really got me interested in what Jason was doing with Deer Food Plus, because I thought, boy, there's the microcosm right there. You can really impact that however many acres and really accelerate the speed with which you change things, and education, because education is the key. We're going to keep doing it the same old way until somebody comes along and says, hey, look over here. What about this? We're going to keep doing it the same old way because we're addicted to it.
Yeah, I had a client. To the speed. You'll enjoy this. I had a client last week. He's struggling a little bit with some of his fields that he's pulled synthetics from. And he says, I'm disappointed. Let me send you some pictures. He sends me some pictures, and the plants are knee high. Now, these are warm season annuals. They're knee high. I called him up. I said, are you crazy? He said, what do you mean? I said, you just grew knee high plants with zero fertilizer. Go find your local farmers and tell them you did that. That's the question, is how are these plants growing without fertilizers 3 years down the road? That's the question you should be asking yourself.
That was so funny when because there's a modeling group there at ARS where I worked at the USDA, and I'll never forget, this was many, many years. This is like 15 or 16 years ago. And I was in there and they asked me to sit in, and I was listening to them, and they were running through their model. And I asked them, I said, what if you put zero synthetic fertilizer inputs? Run that. And the yield came back 0. And I went, oh my God. Oh my God. And I pointed that out. And they're modelers. They're way beyond me as far as the math and science and stuff. But that simple little thing escaped them.
Input. Yeah. It's garbage in, garbage out.
You put in no synthetic fertilizer, you get no yield.
That's like the global warming research I read recently. That took 100 or 125 year time period snapshot. I don't know how long Earth has been here. I've only been here for 44 years, but I'm pretty sure it's been here longer than 100 and some years. And in the last 125 years, there was a trend that the Earth was warming. So guess what? They put that in the model and they extrapolated, and they said, guess what? This is what's going to happen. The Earth is going to warm. We're going to die, and the ice is going to melt, and the polar bears, which are actually on the rebound and doing really well, are going to all die. So it's the same thing. I guess, Bronson, where I was going with this ultimately, I have a big note here for myself. Testing. Rick has mentioned it. Obviously, Rick has swam upstream. Rick, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know how he has managed to do as good as he has done with his career. He's now retired, with the people who he had to deal with who do not understand. They have PhDs. They've spent a lot of money. Their parents spent a lot of money. People throw research money at them. They don't understand how the system works, and they're still throwing they're using a test that relies on inputs. So Bronson, how will you test the soils in a project like this? What will you look? I know you're obviously with the extension, and universities like to run Malick and dump chemicals. We did that when I was there. We had gloves like we were birthing cows up to our shoulders, and we couldn't get the chemical on us, but it's okay to dump it in the soil, on the life in the soil. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
We will be using tests that, speaking with people like you and others, would be, I want to say blessed. I don't know if that's the right word, but something that is agreed upon by the Regen ag community is a valid test or suite of tests. Mm-hmm. But that would certainly absolutely be part of it. Is we want to use the metrics that you use, and of course have advisement on season to season, warm season to cool season, seeking input and saying, this is what it's telling us. What do we do next? Because, Jason, I mean, there's a lot of reasons here, but this would be a big failure for us, is if we got 5 years down the road and here are the results, and the community at large, or at least the movers and shakers of the Regen ag community, said, but you didn't do it right. Yeah. I mean, I would want to jump off a cliff. I'm like, oh my God, we just wait. So yeah, that's why we want to be completely upfront with, here's what we're doing. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the way you need to do it. Yeah, here's what we're planning. Yeah,
I get it.
We want everybody to agree on it.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah,
cool.
I mean, we want to be doing it like you would be doing it.
Well, at the lab I'm working with, they do a lot of. I have all this access today, so a lot of people are running the PLFA test along with the Haney test on the same sample, and boy, has that been eye-opening, because you're looking at total microbial living biomass versus the Haney test and its activity and its nutrient availability and all that stuff, and that has just been so eye-opening.
Yep. And Rick, for a biologist like me who studied along with Bronson's help, when he was an instructor, which was really hard to follow because he's super intelligent, talking about predator-prey relationships with coyotes and wolves, and how obviously you can't have the predator without the prey, and vice versa. That the PLFA and the protozoa to bacteria and just that predator-prey relationship has been really cool to me to watch change on my property and client properties over the 5 or 6 year term. I was disappointed in, they say the protozoa are like the predators, right? So yep. I like predators. I guess I'm like Bruce Leopold in that regards. I'm like, I want predators because I know that the system collapses. And Aldo had the same input without the predators, and the response to our management of those numbers has gradually, it is gradual, but it has gotten better over time.
Well, on the PLFA test, that's the first thing I look at is protozoa. That's the first.
Why would you do that? What does that tell you?
Because if it's zero, I'm it's like, okay, whatever. And it's really interesting. If you graph the soil health calculation versus protozoa, and the protozoa are there, the soil health is up. It's just black and white.
Yeah. It's the apex of the system.
Just
like the wolves were, and yeah.
And I recently came up with a calculation that I've given to Lance just actually this morning, and it's going to be called PLFA Health, and it's going to look at a combination of those things and give you a score to give you, just kind of see where you're at, instead of trying to decipher all those numbers.
Good deal. So I'm going to throw out a couple of thoughts I had wrote down here and Bronson, you can chime in and disagree, or Rick, you can do whatever. That soil biology, and I think this needs to be the focus of any research, is the driver of plant nutrition. And I would say the water supply as well. And I think we've lost control of that. Most of what, we currently do now with food plots, I'll target food plots. And again, Bronson, you brought up natural systems. Obviously, hey, listen, people say, well, you have a food plot company. I could care less. I could shut that down tomorrow and it wouldn't affect whether or not my bills are paid. I created that because no one else is doing it like I'm doing it. A couple have tried to copy. But I wish some other good ones would come out, and not just copy, but actually be, a thought leader and, try to create something good. But most of what we do and know and practice right now regarding growing plants, it centers around putting synthetics into the ground, which is a complete dysfunctional system. Rick mentioned the bug in a jug. I have that wrote down here. That's what everybody, they say, okay, what do I need to add? And I say plants and pray for moisture, or do whatever you do to get moisture, rain to come, as Rick just mentioned. I think it's time that we look at the soil as that main source of nutrients. And I don't know how we get that across to people after listening to some of Mossy Oak's podcasts. I'm going to pick on them, Bronson. You don't have to mention. I know they're a contributor or whatever. And one of my favorite camos to this day is Mossy Oak Bottomland. But I listened to some of their podcasts and I'm just like, gosh, how are we going to move the needle without educating more of these people about the fact Rick mentioned, or one of you mentioned it earlier, about this biodiversity or plant diversity is important for herbivores. It's also important for, if you have a diverse plant selection, you have a diverse root selection. If you're feeding diverse root exudates to a diverse group of biology in the soil, and it's all working together. And obviously as a result, you have different food combinations and foraging sequencing. And I hope these are all things that eventually universities do address, because it seems like there's a certain crowd of people who don't want to do anything unless the research supports it. And I think these are areas that we've been missing them in modern agriculture. And food plotting is, and again, I'm not saying food plots are the holy grail or they should be the only component. My clients know I don't push food plots as the only component of their property. That client I mentioned in Missouri who called me, he was just selected by the state of Missouri to have his property written about in their magazine. I forget what they call it, their conservation magazine, about ideal turkey habitat. They visited the property, saw two hens with broods, and he said to me, Jason, regenerative agriculture this is a retired business owner, large property owner. Regenerative wildlife agriculture, regenerative food plotting, and soil health are extremely important to me. It is the most important thing to me. He said, but I'm frustrated because I talked about it a lot when they were here, but I don't think they're going to cover any of it in the article. And I laughed and I said, I'm not surprised. Don't let it bother you. Keep on keeping on. There's a reason that they're there. The fact that those hens and poults are bugging in that habitat that, by the way, hasn't been preemptively bombed for armyworms and blah, blah, et cetera.
Well, let me give you a quick little experience that I had that I'll never forget. We had a high-level USDA person come to the lab one time, and we had corn planted out there, and then and right next to it, we had pollinator strips. Okay, this is a management issue. And so I took the ranger and drove him out there, and I got in the middle of that cornfield and shut it off. Just ran over the corn. I didn't care. I said, listen. I shut the engine off. I said, I want you to listen. And he did. He said, I don't hear anything. I said, okay. Started up, drove right in the middle of pollinator strips. This is like 20 acres of pollinators. That's diverse. And shut it off. And I said, what do you hear? He said, my God. I said, yes. It's the insects and bugs, bees were everywhere. And I said, that is the impact of management and educating ourselves and farmers to understand how the system works. Because what you heard over there was dead silence. And what you heard over here was life.
Yes. Yes.
So what are we going to do here?
And that's a solid point.
He was like, he just really didn't know what to say, because we're so busy running through life at Mach 3 that if somebody taps you on the shoulder, you're 2 miles away by the time you turn around and go, what was that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we've got to get better at that.
And that's one of the things that Fred Provenza taught me. I now do, I observe more. I'll just sit by an old oak somewhere and just observe. I know that sounds weird, but there's a lot of people out there who tune up their vehicles or change the oil or whatever, when you can pay someone to do that all weekend, and that's their thing. But I think, I have a similar story to share, Rick. I was asked to be on a video podcast with a guy, and I said, yep, that sounds great. I set my stool, I think it was a rocking chair, old rickety rocking chair, up in the middle of my cover crop field. This is about a month ago, maybe. And it was about 3 days from getting roller crimped because it was ready to go. But hairy vetch was flowering, and there was probably, 20 or 30 different. And there's native stuff. There's things that my local biologist would call invasive, toxic, noxious, non-native, like him. And there was so much biomass there, also Bronson, and there was life. And I stuck my rocking chair in the middle of this cover crop field, set up a cheap tripod, and put my cell phone on that tripod. And he said, "Oh my gosh, where are you?" I said, "I'm in the middle of one of my cover crop fields. And I thought it would be a great idea to show you, as we talk about soil health and regen ag, etc., what it should look like, instead of just writing a magazine article or whatever about it." And I realized about 3 minutes into our intro that I had made a massive mistake. This thing must look hilarious because which was an hour and a half, maybe more, the entire time I was swatting insects, pulling them out of my shirt. They were on my eye, in my ears. That place was full of life. And I get people who come to my farm, family, even my wife, they say, they'll come up the driveway and they'll say things like, "I've never seen so many different bird species." These are people who are not wildlifers. They're not hunters. Hell, some of them don't even get outside of town 99% of the time. But when they step on a farm that is managed, zero synthetics, no till, no chemicals, no preemptive strikes for army worms or whatever, I don't worry about mare's tail. I just farm in nature's image and observe. They always say this place is so full of life. And it's cool because I have clients in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, Iowa, Indiana, whatever, and they say the same thing. They say it's just, you can tell. You don't need the science. So maybe we don't need the science. I don't know. I'm just throwing that. Bronson's going to kill me for saying that. Maybe we don't need it. Maybe we just need to learn to observe.
I think you need both. I think you need the power of observation and the science, because they'll actually reinforce each other.
Right.
If we're looking in the right direction, they'll reinforce each other.
I agree.
And one of the knocks that I hear on the stuff about food plots and what you're talking about, Jason, is that, but that's such a small scale, you can control those things. Well, but perhaps it depends. There are farmers that I know that are doing these regenerative agriculture on the scale of 10,000 acres, 7,000 acres, 5,000 acres. So the ones that say you can't do that at scale are they need to go talk to those folks. Mm-hmm. It can be done. And we just, don't want to upend everything and to change it. But ultimately, it's going to have to change. It just is.
Right.
Hey, wow. Jason.
Yes, sir.
Real quick. I apologize. I'm going to have to jump here in a minute because work is calling, so to speak. I've got two questions for y'all. And I apologize that we just have a limited amount of time to answer them, because I feel y'all could go into a great deep discussion on this. Some confusion on things I have read. I would love for y'all to clear it up or give me your opinion. So
go ahead. We'll wrap it up with this, Bronson, and we can absolutely do more of these shooting from the hip sessions as we go. So we'll go ahead and use that and wrap it up.
So the three things I hear that you need to stop doing: stop tillage, stop herbicide application, stop with the synthetic fertilizers. But I will often hear some of them say, but if I had to include one of those, sparingly, not year after year, if I had to include one of those sparingly, it would be this. And what I find interesting is that at least 4 or 5 different times I've been reading these experts, and they'll have a different tillage. It's okay every 3 years to till. It's okay every 3 years if you need a glyphosate application, for example. What is y'all's feeling on that? What would be your answer?
Rick, I'm going to answer it quick, and I'll let you take the technical aspect. I'm laughing because I told a client, I tell my clients the same thing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not anti any of this. I believe in reading nature based on what, after the management, how does nature respond, period. Unfortunately, she doesn't respond very well to everything that you just mentioned. So I had a client who said to me, well, wait, man, you told me last week if you had to choose, you would spray before you till. This week you said I'd till before I spray. And it's funny because it depends which topic I'm thinking about, researching, reading about more, or what I'm doing on my farm. But I guess I would ask you, how does nature has, these chemicals we use, and by the way, these antibiotics we pump into our bodies are all stolen in one way or another from nature, and they're made super heroic in a lab so that you can put it in a little, pill or whatever and dump it in your system. So I avoid all of them. That doesn't mean that's the right thing for everybody. I have clients who are at every part of that continuum. Some of them are like me, and they said, I don't want to be a wiener. I'm off 100%. But yet there are some of them where we make a management decision, a game time decision, and we say, you know what? A responsible application of glyphosate right now may be our only bet. But that, Bronson, is only because we put ourselves in that position. I told a guy the other day on a podcast, I keep a mirror in my, the big metal clipboards we use there at Mississippi State for, you can put papers in them and stuff. I carry one of those all over the country, and I keep a little mirror in it. It's now broken. And he says to me, look at this weed, whatever weed it is. And I throw my mirror out there, and he goes, what the hell is that? And I said, there's the cause. Look at that mirror. That's the cause of that weed. And they start to think about, well, what do you mean? Well, that weed is there because of you. It's your management. So, yes, take that for what it's worth. Go ahead, Rick. I'll let you. Which one, in your experience, is worse?
See, I'm not falling into that trap. That's a context issue, and I'll give you a quick example. We had a guy in Kansas years ago, couldn't get his cover crop planted. His ground was too hard. Tried for 2 years. I told him to rip all of it, and then plant his cover and go back to no-till. Mm-hmm. I had a guy that was about to lose his entire crop if he didn't, get the cover crops killed while his cash crop was coming up, before it came up. He was going to lose it all, then spray. It's all about, as you said, we're not anti anything. We're anti too much of anything. Watch the show Fantastic Fungi and talk to me about tillage. I would hate to till, but if you can't get the cover crops in the ground to help the fungi grow, then and if you have to till to do that, then till to do that.
Yeah, and likewise, I hate tillage myself. We have we've tilled, planted Spring Reload or one of my Reload products, tested CO2 Burst or ST1 in field before and after. Yeah, it's like a kick in the cookies, and the biology takes a hit, but it's pretty incredible how resilient it is.
Soil is resilient, and so if you're doing your best to follow regenerative principles, and you get caught in a situation where you've got to do one of those 3 things, just do it, and whatever gets you through the night.
Agree.
So Jason, you'll love this. The official answer: it depends.
The official answer is
that's it.
It's a function of your context. Another quick example. I had a client in southern Missouri who said he was completely bummed. I'm going to spray my plot. Warm season annual. Yeah, there's quote unquote weeds, which are actually really great plants. And by the way, when you're farming in nature's image like this, some of these weeds, Bronson, you'll love this, that they don't just eat them like they do on, dysfunctional soils that you're looking at. They absolutely love them. And when you look at what's in their stool, they're eating plants that my USDA locally here want me to spray Roundup on, which is a whole nother podcast in and of itself. So I told him, I said, you're nuts for spraying Roundup. You're nuts for doing anything to it. We have 24 inches of plant growth, incredibly diverse. Leave it go. This is your cover crop, right? I think I said this is your cover crop, stupid, because most of my clients are close friends. Leave it go. Just because there's a weed there that you don't like, guess what? That root system is pretty massive down there. It's extensive. It's pumping carbon. It's pumping everything else. Leave it go. Our cash crop's coming up, which is late summer. He'll put a cool season in there, and we'll kill plenty of deer.
Gotcha. Jason, I had another one, but I think we're too close to being out of time here. But I'll go ahead and introduce it, and next time we talk, then we can talk more about it.
Yes, sir.
Is clients that don't have the equipment. So I lease land, coming up with a scenario here. I lease land. We have ATVs. We don't have a drill. We don't have a roller crimper. Maybe someday I'll invest and do that. But in the meantime, what can I do?
Yep.
I'd love in the future to hear your thoughts on that.
I see where you're going with it. Had a contractor show up to my house one day to build $100,000, do a $100,000 reno, and he came with no tools. I'll just float that out there. That's my analogy.
Yeah. Gotcha.
At some point, you have to be a big boy. Having said that, yes, there are people who have incredible. I'll get people sending me emails, Bronson, with pictures. I know you got to go. And I start to ask them about the management, and it was nothing more than an over-the-shoulder hand crank, and they put it on at the right time, and they had 5 inches between their ears. And I'm like, now you are a food plotter who should get a medal. They're out there, buddy, but it takes between the ears and patience. So, guys, I do appreciate it. This is an hour and a half plus. I know both of you are busy, and we will do this again. I think the listeners will love this because there's a crazy dynamic going on there, right? And both of you are extremely important individuals to me. I've learned and continue to learn so much from both of you, and I love the ribbing and the banter and the Q&A. So, gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your day, and I want to thank everybody else for listening. We will be back with more. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys.